Okay, we're going to start with. Bom, gostaria de apresentar Geri Augusto, que é quem vai moderar essa sessão. Ela é professora visitante em estudos africanos e tem uma afiliação à Brown University também. Ela trabalha com epistemologia da prática, conhecimento subjugado, história da ciência e tecnologia.
Practice and the praxis of radical black transnationalism in the United States, South Africa, and Brazil. Geri was one of the organizers of this event and helped us put this amazing program together. And so she and all the other people who helped us do this, Sidney Chaluvi, Bruno, and Leila, and Geri, and Anani DeGenio, and all the people who've been participating, I want to thank you all again because I'm really pleased so far with the outcome. And as Geri will explain, this is going to be one of the events which will have a person Skyping in.
Welcome to the panel on religion, ethnicity, and the Brazilian state, or in plainer terms, a panel that invites us to continue to think more explicitly about exclusions and hierarchies, and what that means for building a democracy. So this is not just about what some people call intolerance, though that's bad enough, but it's about institutionalized racism and, quite frankly, about hatred. I had some things that I was preparing to say since last night for this panel, but I have thrown most of them away because I think that the best introduction, part of an introduction to this panel, is the three panels that have gone before. I've watched a kind of a cumulative building of something that they taught me in Angola is called conhecimento da causa. People who know what the matter is about because they've experienced it. And that doesn't always happen at the university. It doesn't always happen in the classroom or in spaces like this. And I think that the build-up, the progression of discussions, of presentations and discussions that we've had thus far is actually of people with conhecimento da causa, which paves the way for this, this particular discussion. Conhecimento, of course, is knowledge, and one of the things that struck me about the previous panel is how much art is not just entertainment and aesthetics and beauty, but how much art is also a repository of knowledge and a way to transmit and to share knowledge. In the same way, religion is not just a set of beliefs, but it is often also a system of knowledge. And so I think that this panel will help us in thinking further about the same things that we've been thinking about since last night. And there's one additional form of knowledge that we hope to be able to bring in, which is the knowledge of indigenous peoples and traditional communities, in particular, indigenous communities. It so happens that this week is in Brazil what they call Abril Vermelho, Red April, and it's a week, this week, which is dedicated to the rights of indigenous peoples. Therefore, all the people that we invited, that we wanted to come to participate, physically in this meeting, could not come. We're fortunate to have one person whom we're going to try to bring in, if the gods of technology will allow, by Skype. Okay. So I threw away everything that I was going to say, but I did want to relate one thing which came to me by colleagues and friends and compañeros de luta in Salvador, by WhatsApp, which is the way I think all Brazilians do almost everything they do that has to do with information, by WhatsApp. And so I told them that, yes, I would relate this. This past January, I attended in Bahia a ceremony in the terreiro, Casa do Mensageiro, in Barra do Pujuca, in a little town called Camaçari in Bahia. The terreiro, which for those who are not from Brazil, is the house of worship and the surrounding, often natural sanctuary, had been invaded by 6 armed men who stole sacred objects, beat up the Pai do Santo, assaulted visiting guests, stole a car, and desecrated the terreiro by pronouncing words of hate. Only a few weeks later, which is when I was there, with the solidarity of the neighborhood and sister terreiros in Bahia and even further away, things were recomposed. But these and other acts which are occurring with increasing frequency and given cover of official sanction or implicit encouragement at the highest levels, have also led to resistance. So the WhatsApp was explaining to me about a new mode of resistance fostered by an organization called the Makota Valdina National Front, just recently created, as a broad forum to defend African-derived religions and organize a national struggle against racism and religious hatred. They're calling this new form of resistance and refusal o ebo coletivo, the collective ebo. Now, the traditional ebo is an offering to clean and strengthen the spirit, usually something individual and done in the sanctuary. But this one is different, and they sent me pictures of it. It's taking place in very public spaces with people gathered to protest out loud and peacefully, with music and dancing and information-based denunciation against religious racism. And they're taking it online, too. So I was thinking maybe we could stretch the idea even further of a collective able against all the types of exclusion and systematic inequality which are a challenge to democracy. So if we wanted to think about that, yet another form of resistance is being generated. In this session, we will have 3 speakers, 2 at least I'm sure, and the 3rd if possible, who are well placed to invoke, provoke, and inform such a collective able. First, we have Professor Erisvaldo Santos, who is a professor of education at the Federal University of Ouro Preto and the coordinator of the research group for the training of professors about ethnic racial relations. He is also a Babalorisha in the house of, I've translated it from Yoruba into English, it's easier for me, House of Ashe Ogun, oh, that's Portuguese, man. House of Ashe Ogun traz alegria, the house where Ogun brings happiness or brings joy. He's also, of course, a Babalorisha in Contagem, Minas Gerais. That was his terreiro, or is. Sônia Guajajara has a BA degree in literature and a postgraduate specialization in special education at the State University of Maranhão. She translates the spirit of resistance of the Guajajara Tentejar and is an important indigenous leader. In 2018, she was the vice presidential candidate of the PSOL, Party of Liberty, Freedom, Socialism and Freedom. And finally, Michel Gherman, who's also present, is a professor of history and the co-coordinator of the Interdisciplinary Center for Arab and Jewish Studies at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. He has an MA in anthropology and sociology from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and is the author of articles and book chapters on Jewish and Middle Eastern studies, as well as the book, Portuguese again, Início do Sionismo no Brasil, Ambiguidades da História. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming them, and we will start with Professor Erisvaldo Santos. I should also say that everything has to be said directly into the microphone. If not, Sônia can't hear and can't respond.
Boa tarde.
I'd like to begin by giving deep thanks to Jim and to Ramon. The two, main organizers of my coming here to this event. And, in the process of thanking them, I'm going to start my talk asking for forgiveness. In my tradition, it's customary to ask permission before coming, and so we ask permission by greeting the ancestors. And the greeting that we do here goes to black men and women who helped to construct this university, enslaved people. I want them to hear my greeting and my praise to these ancestors that helped build this great university, and that today opens its doors to multiple voices, among them mine. Somebody from Bahia, Jequié, the kind of the interior of Bahia. I'm a professor. I've been a professor for 13 years. I have a doctorate in education. I studied philosophy with the Jesuits, and I had the privilege of being a student of one of the great philosophers of our country, who was Father Henrique Cláudio Vaz, who is the astrologer and guru. That the astrologer and guru kind of tried to discredit. But what comes from beneath is unable to reach what's on high. So this father, he's in the beyond, and he made his contribution to Brazilian philosophy, and he continues to give it because his work is still alive in Brazil. But how is it that we explain, and this is the same question that my colleagues have already asked, how does a Pai de Santo, this religious leader, how does he study philosophy? Because the place of philosophy is the place of reason, and there's no space for primitive reason, this perverse, cursed reason, which is the reason and the logic of African traditions. And so I want to articulate my talk here. I want to say that for us to be able to understand the religious racism and the persecution that African religions continue to suffer in Brazil, it's necessary for us to think about the structure of the Brazilian state from the perspective of the Republic. We think that, we think from this perspective of the Republic, but we know that everything was thought through in the second half of the 19th century, when it was decided that Brazil would not be a country of blacks, when it was decided that Brazil would preserve its European ancestry, when it was decided that we would make Africans and their descendants go back to Africa. However, Africans and Afro-descendants built Brazil, not only from the perspective of the material perspective, but also the spiritual perspective. And it's this conversation that we need to have, in the logic of that religion is also a structure of knowledge. And if we think about religion as a structure of knowledge, it's the anti-religious perspective that's still alive in some academic centers and in some kind of academic niches and spaces. It only contributes to put in check the Afro-Brazilian traditions and religions. Why is it cursed? Why or defamed? Why? Because these religions, they're part of the great black university in Brazil, because that's where the knowledge, the traditional knowledge, is the traditional knowledge that's denied and rejected at universities. The knowledge that cures. Afro-Brazilian religions preserve and transmit these forms of knowledge and cure. But in the last 15 years, why has the persecution increased? Why has it increased? Because in the last 15 years, we have been able to, with black activism organized, starting at the end of the 70s, and all the struggles that we engaged in order to preserve black culture, we were able to make the Brazilian state move forward in the sense of guaranteeing and preserving, protecting in law the the valuing and preserving of the Afro-Brazilian history and tradition. And for many, including historians, Professor Sidney, for example, it was an imposition from top down. It wasn't our victory. It wasn't the victory of black activism. It was an imposition. It was a mandate. And it wasn't going to facilitate the discussion of this in the university, because university resists not only affirmative action policies, but also it resists implementing the strategies that are adopted and that are important in preserving black culture. And so this resistance on the part of universities has an implication. In a moment like this, it really important implications. The resistance of universities was unable to prevent us from black activists to do their research on, their master's theses, PhD dissertations, studying Candomblé, Umbanda, these Afro-Brazilian religions, bringing to light the things that the Brazilian government didn't want to know about. We showed that we brought to light the things that the Brazilian government always wanted to discard and leave by the wayside. Because what was prioritized in Brazil was always the Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian values. Right? African traditions were not considered civilized. They were not part of the civilizing project. And this is what caused the minister, before assuming her role, to go to this place and say that now people are teaching about the devil in school, because to her, Eshu is the devil. It's anti-God. Now, we that are of the religion, we know that Eshu is not the devil, and we need to affirm this in every space, that those who say that Eshu is the devil are those from the Judeo-Christian tradition, because nobody treats the Greek gods, the Roman divinities, deities, as being of the devil, as being anti-Christian. But the African deities, they're all from the devil. So how do we understand this? How do we combat this? Because it's so ingrained in Brazil. So this civilizing model, it's not out of touch with the Brazilian reality. Of course, especially in a moment in which school curricula are being constructed and selecting that which prioritizes what'll help us civilize Brazil, and excluding that which will not help us civilize Brazil. So in the school curricula today it's a big challenge that we have to face in terms of trying to give space to African traditions and religions. And the Brasilia, the country's capital, that's one of the places where we have to engage in this fight. And the government that's in power now will be provisional, will be temporary, because unlike Marcia, I believe that we live and we hold on to hope. We live and we fight with hope. And we live and fight with hope because we resolve a lot of things in ritual. And what does that mean, to resolve a lot of things, to solve a lot of problems in rituals of Ebois? Solving lots of problems in these rituals means that between the Aye and the Orun, between the earth and heaven, there is a relationship. There is a a central link between those two things, and that link is Eshu, Lord of all paths, and who permits me today to speak here. It's with Eshu that we speak as a divinity, as a deity, who is actually closer to God than the neo-Pentecostals, the intolerant, racist, closed-minded evangelicals could ever imagine. So it's with Eshu that we establish our great connections, because Eshu, just like Greek philosophy, he is the Lord of Aporia, of the crossroads. And it's at the crossroads that we generally are able to overcome the challenges of exclusion, the challenges of religious racism. Why do we have, and I'm using the term religious racism and not religious intolerance, because our tradition is, it's denied, it's challenged, it's cursed, because it's a tradition of black people. It's the heritage that resists white expectations, because though the racist white people at the end of the 19th century, as they were trying to construct this country, they believed that tradition would not last very long. Donald Pilson, when he was in Bahia, speaking with a young man who was the son of a man who practiced candomblé, but the young man had been educated. He was asked if he wasn't from that religion, and he said, "No, I'm not from that religion. That's something that backward people practice, that black people practice." And so, when everybody has access to education, when everybody is able to go to school, this religion is going to disappear. It wasn't Donald Pilson who said this, it was the young man he was interviewing. So now you can understand what does it mean, what it means at the end of the 1930s. This idea of whitening, of eugenics, and the idea that cultural heritage the African heritage and traditions would disappear. And we had in Brazil black activists who insisted that we should abandon this idea of discussing African heritage, that it wasn't going to lead anywhere, and that and this sociologist he said that this idea of valuing African tradition wouldn't get us anywhere, but we resisted. And what makes people uncomfortable today, what makes the elites uncomfortable, the racists uncomfortable, is the fact that not only did we resist, but we also expanded the field of action and our voice in defending our tradition. And in doing so, this amplification of our voice and of our influence is carried forward by black activists who are engaged, and also with other groups who are sympathetic to our cause, and religious leaders of Candomblé and Umbanda, and intellectual production that's very significant. And this makes people very uncomfortable. And what has made people even more uncomfortable in the last elections was when we made a big movement to put forward candidates, male and female candidates, who were from our religions. I was a candidate for the Communist Party in Brazil, and we talked about, we need to show that we are present, that we're engaged in this fight. And I said, okay, only with one condition. I'm not going to put the Babalorisha over the professor, because I have a lot more influence in the university sphere, and I'm not going to put the Babalorisha above that. It's going to be Professor Erisvaldo. So that part of my identity was what I was going to capitalize on. And they said, no, but in Bahia it's going to be this way, in Rio Grande do Sul it's going to be this way. I said, no, what's important is that we put candidates from our tradition forward and spread our ideas, and the idea that power is important, and we need to dispute power to guarantee that religion will continue to be valued. And so in that sense, it's necessary for us to put our foot in the door and say that even though we've been rejected, and even though we've been denied opportunities and denied being seen as a valuable tradition, we will continue to resist and worshiping our sacred deities. The question of animal sacrifice was the last big fight in the Supreme Court, and we mobilized, and the process was debated, and was debated in all throughout Brazil, and we were present at we went to the sessions in which this was debated at the Supreme Court, and we sent the message that we exist, and we're going to continue to sacrifice our animals, even if they prohibit this, because during slavery we did it clandestinely. Thank you.
Welcome. I don't know if you can hear me. Estamos tentando contato agora com a Sônia. Welcome. Can you speak? Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation. I'd like to greet all of you who are there today, which for us is a holiday, not because it's a day for indigenous people, but because it's a holy day. It's Holy Friday, Good Friday. And even it being the day of the Indian in the calendar, for us, it would be the day of the indigenous people, because it's not the Indian. We are many, we are diverse, we are peoples, each their own way, their own culture, their own tradition, and their own ways of life. In Brazil, we are 305 different indigenous peoples who speak 274 different languages, and even then, in Brazil, there's an official language, which is European. Portuguese is not ours. Ours is the Brazilian language, but we speak Portuguese. So that already shows us how much Brazil disconsiders this presence since the beginning. So there are already hundreds of languages spoken in Brazil, and even then, we adopted the borrowed language. And since then, there's always been this attempt and this domination from outside that has taken control over our peoples. Initially, us, the indigenous who were already here, and then the Portuguese, the European arrival, some call it a discovery, including the schools that insist to call it a discovery. Others call it an invasion. And we can also call it an encounter. An encounter of the indigenous peoples who were here with those who arrived, the European. And of course, an encounter marked by many confrontations, many misencounters, and above all, a lot of violence and extermination. It's an encounter that is marked to this day that was then influenced by the arrival of black people, forcibly brought into the country. So the beginning was indigenous and Europeans, and a little bit later blacks, that have made this such a mixed country that even Brazil itself disconsiders, because our indigenous presence here is ignored, or even a reason for racism, because all of this miscegenation makes it so that everyone looks at us and say, you're not indigenous anymore, you're no longer indigenous, because you don't even look like an Indian. So we still measure being or being indigenous by physical appearance, and that's no longer the case anymore. We are indigenous because of our roots, because of our origin, especially this feeling of belonging that peoples have. That's what constructs our identity. So for 5 centuries, we've existed, but we existed throughout all of colonization. We resisted to the empire when they tried to exterminate again and impose into us another culture. We resisted the dictatorship. We resisted the coup. The state coup from a few years ago, the latest one. And now we're living another moment, which is this fascism installed in Brazil, the institutionalized fascism. Because when you have a president who is an authority that incites hate and violence, he's opening that space so that all of his followers that have the same ideas feel very comfortable in practicing their violence and spewing the hate and racism against indigenous people. So the moment that we're living in Brazil is that. It's a very tense moment. And it's a tense moment that is that is caused by these measures, by these anti-indigenous measures, these racist measures, these very violent measures. So for us, the indigenous people, on the first day of 2019, we were, I can't even say it was surprised, but we were approached by the provisional measure 870, published by the Bolsonaro government, when amongst many rights that were undone, he moved the FUNAI, which is the institutional government department that regulates indigenous lands. He took it from the Justice Ministry and moved it into the Human Rights Ministry, and then removed from the FUNAI the demarcation of indigenous land and gave it to the Ministry of Agriculture. So with that measure, he not only fragilized the institution which oversees indigenous peoples, but also gave power over the indigenous lands to the agribusiness. So it's now a decision that is going to be taken by landowners. So it already shows the intention of this government, which is from its start. from its campaign, he already said in his campaign that during his government, indigenous people wouldn't get even a centimeter of land. So right after this provisional measure, the conflicts intensified in Brazil. There's more than 15 sites of real conflict so far, which have incited the population to burn buildings for education and health inside indigenous lands. People coming into indigenous lands and deforesting it. So it gave space for the logging industry and the mineration industry to come in indigenous lands and start deforesting and taking the land. Not even to mention the strategy that they're using, which is to provoke the confrontation. So they're trying to instigate indigenous leadership into physical confrontations, and also instigating inter-leaderships confrontations. So they want indigenous leaderships to fight amongst themselves, which is an old strategy of the colonizer in order to control and dominate. So we're in this very tense moment where the discourse of these authorities, the president and his ministers, incite even more, progressively more, the society against indigenous peoples. So we don't know where this is going, because now we're starting our free land camp, which is the largest indigenous manifestation in the world, is the largest indigenous assembly in Brazil, but it's also considered the largest indigenous assembly in the world, because unites indigenous peoples from all over the country, but has been gathering a presence of indigenous people from other countries, which is very strong. And now the president has done a Facebook Live calling it a big meet of Indians that is being done with public money, which is a lie, which is a huge lie. It does not surprise us, because since he was elected on fake news, he continues to preach his fake news and inciting society against the people, against indigenous people, against women, against people from the peripheries, against professors, against teachers. So it's a very grave moment, it's a very somber moment, because not only reminds us of dictatorship, the 1964 military dictatorship, but also the government has manifested frequently, very nostalgically, towards the 64 dictatorship. So during Bolsonaro wants to commemorate the military coup. He wants to. This is the period that exterminated people, that killed people. More than 8,000 indigenous people. Those are the ones that have been confirmed by the National Commission of Truth that were killed and tortured during the dictatorship. It was a very violent moment. It was a bloody moment, and the current president wants to formally commemorate it. So, of course, Brazil refused and denied it because it is not normal for somebody to preach that. It is not normal. So we have a very conflictuous government and a very confusing state. And this confusion is going through all sectors of society. It's a moment of instability, and it makes it so that we feel this need to react. We need to react. We need to gather. We, the indigenous, need to gather with all of our other segments of society, because we can't watch this and stay silent. So with this mobilization, the 15th camp that is happening the 24th to the 26th of April in Brasilia, made it so that the Ministry of Justice, Sérgio Moro, he says that there was an institutional request to support and authorize the National Guard into the ministries where the camp's going to happen, to use force. He authorized the use of force by the National Guard against the camp. It was a official decree in which Sérgio Moro has authorized the use of force against social movements. And that's a way to keep people from manifesting. And they want to keep people from Brasilia. They want to deny us our freedom, and we don't understand what they're afraid of. If they are a government that supports the people, that is a fraternal government, the Ministry of the Human Rights and Family and Women says that she loves indigenous people, then what love is that? They want us not to be who we are. They want to exterminate our culture. When they say we need to be integrated into society, that we need to be citizens like them. So this integration that they want to preach and impose on us is an integration through violence. It makes it so that we abandon our identity. Because when they deny us our right to our land, they are denying us our right to our identity. So we're in a moment where we have three very difficult situations. The first one is the confrontation with the police, because we're not going to stand back, we're not going to stand down. We're gonna do our activity that we've been doing for 14 years. There's no way we're now gonna stop. We're gonna get to Brasilia. So there's a risk. There's a risk with a police confrontation, and there's a risk confrontation amongst family members, between families that have been instigating the social resistance towards indigenous people, and the institutional resistance, the institutional confrontation that attempts to hide between a face of dialogue when they actually just want to co-opt our discourse and fragilize and weaken our struggle. So in the middle of January, we did the Red January, which we did a huge national mobilization, international mobilizations, where more than 70 peoples were mobilized in Brazil, and more than 14 countries that were in solidarity with the indigenous peoples in Brazil, and the embassies and streets and many places. So March 8th, we did another mobilization, a movement, and on the 27th of March, we also did a paralyzation, a strike in Brazil, when the health minister said he would end the Special Secretariat for Indigenous Health, which is a subsection of the health ministry that we've really fought for. And he wanted to make so that the indigenous health would be a municipal problem and not a federal problem. So we really struggled against that and resisted that. We did a lot of protests. We sent a delegation to Brasilia, and the ministers stood down from that. So right now we still have our Secretariat for Indigenous Health in a federal level. That shows that our strength, our organization, our mobilization is worth it. So that's why we keep on fighting. We're gonna go ahead defending our rights, and more than that, defend our lives, defend our existence, defend our identity. Because when we fight for the demarcation of indigenous land, it's much more than just a land. It's a territory. It's what this territory means, this preserved land, what does it mean for us, for our identity. Is what guarantees climate equilibrium and the regulation of rains that protects the waters in the country. So our life is interconnected with the whole world, with all of the world population. So that's why we say that the indigenous cause is not just our responsibility, it's a world responsibility. It's a global responsibility, because people need to understand that our way of life by itself is guaranteeing the water that gets to your house. And we're doing that and paying with our own lives. We're confronting every day rubber bullets, pepper spray, but knowing that it's those territories that work as a barrier against the expansion of the agribusiness, against the exploration of the great mining companies, against the destruction of the planet. So I call all of you to a great alliance, a network in defense of not only the indigenous people, but our own existence. Thank you.
E finalmente vamos ter o Michel Gherman. E depois vamos ter... acho que a Sônia vai poder participar com as perguntas também, mas depende da tecnologia. Então, se tivermos... você...
If you speak in English, I'm going to consecutively translate for her. If you speak in Portuguese, everything's like that.
Boa tarde. O time pediu para falar daqui, então.
They asked me to speak from here, so here I am. I wanted to thank Professor James Green, and Ramon, and all the other organizers who were involved in this important conference and this event. And I think it's very important for us to listen to what we've listened to and reflect in the name of producing effective practices to change what we have been living in Brazil. I prepared, as Sydney had, I prepared in English, but I'm going to speak in Portuguese, and I'm going to probably have some interruptions so that I can think about, translating what I wrote in English and saying it in Portuguese. So I wanted to present the research that we've been doing. Me and a professor from the University of Oklahoma. It's research about that has three challenges. It's dealing with political uses of Israel, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by the new extreme right, especially the Pentecostal, the evangelical right in Brazil. And so I have a couple of challenges in this research project. The first one is that as a historian, I have to deal with a temporality that's not really familiar to me. For this, so last week, for example, Silas Malafaia, the pastor, he made a really important, interesting declaration, and maybe unheard of. He challenges theologically a rabbi about the famous phrase of President Bolsonaro that the Holocaust should be forgiven. In other words, there was a theological challenge of an evangelical pastor to a rabbi, and there's no way for us to not include these kinds of statements in this project, even though it's it's hard for a historian to include things that happened yesterday in the project. The second challenge that we have is because we're trying to do this, and Michel Klein, we're doing this from the Judaic studies perspective, and in Brazil, Judaic studies are generally worked on through a logic in which they see themselves as a very, very differentiated element of Brazilian society. And from our perspective, Judaic studies should be done in Brazil, just as they are in the U.S. and other places, as part of the studies of Brazilian society and not as distinct elements. And the third challenge is how to deal with the political use and religious use of very specific positions that were in a very fixed field and now are being brought to the public sphere. Questions that are central to Brazilian politics when until very recently they were kind of marginal topics, and now they're not marginal anymore. So I'm talking about political uses of religion and of other people's religions in the public sphere. So Bolsonaro and his government, they chose Israel as one of their first destinations in terms of visits after his election. So the relationship with Israel did not begin just in 2018, though, after the election results. Bolsonaro's sons, they had already put forth, they'd already visited Israel in 2017 when Bolsonaro was running for president, and he was baptized in the in the waters of the River Jordan, which produced a clear connection with the large evangelical conservative audience in Brazil. It's safe to say that Bolsonaro's candidacy was intertwined with religious perspectives, and from there Bolsonaro transformed himself into kind of a chosen candidate. And maybe this name is related with his middle name, which is Messias. Brought by the people of God in Brazil, he was basically, the evangelical and neo-Pentecostal population in Brazil. They supported him, but it wasn't only this religious group that supported him in his run for candidacy for presidency. Other groups, another group that supported him, we can call the people, the chosen people of Brazil. They saw in Bolsonaro the hope of ending hostility against Israel and against Jews in Brazil. And this other group it consists of conservative sectors of the Jewish communities in Brazil. These sectors believed that the Brazilian left had a profoundly anti-Semitic perspective, an anti-religious perspective, and they understood that the connections with Bolsonaro could help Jews to improve their image and improve the image of Israel and Brazilian Jews in this new stage that would be created, in this new era that would be created after the election of the Messiah. And my intention is to begin this presentation showing some pictures of an event that happened, that became famous in Rio, an event that was a key point in Bolsonaro's candidacy. And it was called the Night of Infamy. It happened in a very traditional neighborhood, Laranjeiras, in front of a club, the Hebrew club. And so these two pictures are what I'm talking about. As you can see in these pictures, the protest, there were a lot of Jews present, and you can see that from their clothes and from flags. It was a very organized movement. Young Jews and not only, there were more people other than Jews that were there. And so in this event, I think this is a really important point to highlight. Their protesters, during their protest, they turned their back on the street, and they did not try to convince passersby of their protest and to engage with them. So we can say that beyond being a protest, what we can see, and this is a really important part of the campaign, it was as a confrontation between two sectors of what was apparently the same religious community. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this perspective of the protesters turning their backs on the street and facing this club. This happened in April 2017, this protest in Rio, and the results of it were very dramatic in terms of affecting Jewish life in Brazil and for debates about Israel and Zionism outside of the Jewish community in Brazil. Michel and I, we tried to follow the results of this protest, and our intention here is to propose an initial reflection about the consequences, the political and cultural consequences, not only of this event, but of what came after this event. In truth, our research is focused more not only on this night of infamy, but on other things as well. For the last 3 years, we've been able to see processes of radical change that happened in Brazilian society. And our primary interest in this work is to understand how and if these changes affected groups that are connected to the left and to the right in the Brazilian scene, especially in terms related to Israel and Jews in Brazil. So in this period, our intention has been to understand the political uses of Jewish symbols, Israeli symbols, in political demonstrations and activities that happened primarily in Rio de Janeiro. So from the very beginning of our research, of our study, it was clear that both Jewish and Israeli symbols were part of political activities, primarily of the new Brazilian right, but that they could also be seen on the new Brazilian left. And so in the two cases, Israeli symbols and Jewish symbols and Zionist symbols were easily recognized in political ideas and discourse produced by the new Brazilian right and by a few groups in the new Brazilian left as well. These public discourses, or these political discourses, use, Israeli and Palestinian flags in protests, and also the presence of Jewish symbols in public Christian ceremonies, as you can see here in this picture of the Bishop Macedo, who is the leader of the famous Universal Church, the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God. And so there's a really important use of religious symbols being tied to discourse that's exclusively Christian. There's nothing Jewish that would justify this use of Jewish symbols, because there's an attempt to kind of recuperate the priestly aspects of the Jewish religion, and not on the rabbinical aspects that are more present today. And so I'm talking about the neo-Pentecostal churches and not Judaism. So as Rejane has said, this historian, in Brazil, the groups of the extreme right have behind them the support of an extremely conservative agenda in terms of the moral and the economic perspective. And so for them, for her, these specific agendas in terms of social and political and economic aspects are clear. For them, there is a representation of threats to these kinds of groups. Some groups threat these cultural perspectives, and of course that's true. But who are these groups? Basically, those of the left, Muslims, homosexuals, etc., etc. They threaten, and they would threaten what this new extreme right, this far right, calls cultural values, cultural Western values. It's very common to think that, it's very common to find, rather, in the far right references to conspiracy theories. And for them, it's important to denounce and face and fight such conspiracies. Islamic conspiracies, for example, or gay conspiracies, or Marxist conspiracies, for example, and other kinds of conspiracies that appear depending on their political needs, their daily needs of the far right. So all of these plans are always related to dangerous groups, what that I just talked about. On the other hand, there is the existence of, if there is the existence of these dangerous groups, gays, Marxists, etc., and all of these are very homogeneous groups. On the other hand, there is the existence of positive groups, of collective groups of people that will be beneficial to us. Always these things are presented in a very homogeneous way, right? So the Afro-Brazilians, gays, women's, they're always represented in homogeneous ways. They're always treated as being all the same. Well, the positive groups are also homogeneous. Everyone in them is treated as if they were exactly the same. And so for the new Brazilian right, there's no space for contradictions in these groups. Bad groups are entirely bad. And good groups are entirely good. Everyone in them is good. And so they're understood as enemies or allies, depending on the political will of the person who is observing them. And in this way, these groups are always responsible for bringing curses or blessings. And in these perspectives, connections with Islamic culture, for example, making these connections is a very quick way of bringing curses. Or, for example, connections with leftists, whatever that means. For the new Brazilian right, and not only for the new Brazilian right, but for the new right abroad, as many of you who live in this country know very well, the blessings are brought from the West, from the Western world, the United States, and by Jews, or by Israel. The distinction is not clear. From this new perspective, neo-Orientalist perspective, the world is facing a new clash of civilizations, and this new clash is not related to, not only related to the Arab world or to Islam, as it has been presented in the past. These are no longer the key enemies, or they're not the only enemies. But local groups now become dangerous in the eyes of these people as well. So these local groups are sexual minorities, ideological minorities, who are seen as threats, who are extremely dangerous to the new right. To the new right, Israel is seen as a wall, a kind of stronghold against the expansion of Muslims or LGBT people, or whoever they need to point to. So Israel is, as a defender of Jews, it is used by them as a defender of themselves. So the new Brazilian right sees Jews or Israel, we're not really sure what the distinction is, as part of a Judeo-Christian civilization, or according to the words of the so-called philosopher Olavo de Carvalho, a part of the answer to Western conspiracies that could overturn and destroy the power of evil. Christians, the Christian culture in this sense, is facing a great threat, according to them. So if we wanted to sum up, we could say the threat is secularism. In this perspective, Jews or Israel, the distinction is not clear. They should fight against whatever kind of minority that is not religious. Atheists, leftists, gays, or whatever other group are common enemies. So here, the Christian discourse produces an imaginary Jew and an imaginary Israel. The distinction is not clear here. So in this sense, there is no space for contradictions or breakdowns between the groups. So if we wanted to be more specific, we could say, in the sense of considering yourself an ally of the Christians or an enemy, Jews of Israel are seen from an external perspective. There's not space for religious Jews or conservative Jews or Jews from the right. In the sense of the imaginary Israel, it's seen as representing all of these values. Jews and Israel are part of what you can. They're taken up by the ultra-conservatives in Brazil. There's no space for secular Jews, for Jews of the left, for liberal Jews, for the new Brazilian right. If you're a Jew, if a secular Jew, an atheist Jew, or a leftist Jew, you're not actually a real Jew. Or at least you're not part of the good group of Jews. You're part of the threat, of the danger. You're the problem and not the solution. In other words, the political perspectives of the new right produce their own Jew. And they do this by building an identity of the other. From their own conservative perspective, the Jewish identity is established based on their evangelical perspectives. These identities, these historical identities, are ignored in this process. Jews are from the left, Zionists of the right. All of this means something else. There's a new language coming from the new right that produces the image of the new Jew. So it's not only the new right that produces the new Jew. Sectors of the Jewish community are also producing this new Jew. They are taking up the perspectives that are imposed or perhaps negotiated by these groups. So this new Jewish right also perceives Jews that are not them as non-Jews. And they use their new political connections with the evangelicals as part of a very sophisticated project of power in which the imaginary Israel of the evangelicals becomes the real Israel for them. And in this process of negotiating identity, I propose that we are going through an anthropological process of conversion and unconversion, in which Jews from the left, progressive Jews, secular Jews, are continually submitted to this process of unconversion by the Jewish community and by the evangelical leaders who produce at the same time the idea of a new community. And this new community is a community, an evangelical Jewish community in which we are seeing the new religious identity political project is being articulated, which not only excludes the other, but also includes the other. The progressive Jew is now an inviolable and an impossibility in this new project. And now the evangelical has become more Jewish than the old Jew. Thank you.
So vamos começar com Eduarda, Márcia e depois a Léo. Começar com 3 mulheres. Good afternoon. My name is Eduarda. First of all, thank you, all of you, and Sônia for being here on Skype, for the provocations that you brought us. My question goes particularly to Professor Erisvaldo. I thought your statements very necessary for the debate that Professor Sidney started in the other panel in relation to academic freedom. And you, as a professor in a university for so many years, will definitely know this better than I do, how the academic institution in Brazil is profoundly racist and exclusive. So I'd like you to talk a little bit more about how to think in academic freedom, in academic rigor, in a self-critic way, a self-reflective way, because there is a sort of intellectualism that makes it so that we keep away from self-reflecting on the academic space, and I think your talk really showed us how important this is. So how does this idea of academic freedom and the search for truth and a honest academic debate, also recognizing this incredibly racist discourse of schools that excludes also indigenous discourses. Thank you so much for your talks. Today, the conversations, the talks have been very inspiring. And I'd like to put forward a question to all of the table, including Sônia, and Michel, and Erisvaldo. I was very touched by Erisvaldo's talk in a specific point, including when you mentioned me, because since yesterday I've been provoked by the hope question from last night's panel, and about hope, and talking about my place as a philosopher professor. I'm very concerned about concept building, and it's very important that all of us as activists be preoccupied with the use of concepts. And I was very happy yesterday with Deborah Zuni's talk about the difference between being exiled and banished, expatriated. It's not really translatable, so I'm sorry. But it's important that we all have attention, that we're all alert to all these publications. Because I've seen myself reconstructing the concept of hope based on this crossroads notion that you brought forward, which is very rich in Afro-descendant religions, but also in the very popular in Brazil, in which we say I'm at a crossroads. That's a very popular saying in Brazil. So it's very rich, and it reminds me a lot of Guimarães Rosa, which is somebody who you know very well, and so forth. But I wanted to put this forward, and my question is, I think it is important to make a distinction between the non-thought-through hope that has become commonplace. Also, when Michel brings in question the power project of this citizen who now puts himself forward as a bishop of a huge church. He's writing a project of power, and this idea that he also puts forward of prosperity. And today is the Day of the Indian, and there is a question of the future and all that's been put forward as our shamans in this destruction of ourselves as a white people that is not Indian, not indigenous. So let's put this category forth as very generic. What was this past? What is this Columbus complex that has gone through and decimated Brazil? What is this past in terms of the indigenous genocide? And I'm thinking about this in terms of the concept of hope. What is this future? What can we expect? What does it mean, hope, in this context? In this context where people have been decimated, the indigenous people have been decimated, the black people have been decimated. This project of power that also implicates the destruction of our religious thought that is not the neo-Pentecostal religion, the self-construction of every people and every culture about themselves, in the name being destructed in the name of the new surface that is being constructed in the light of neo-Pentecostalism. Sorry. So I wanted to think about this and thinking that maybe there may not be a future. So I want to go back to the literature field to bring back Kafka when he says there's hope but not for us. So what would be the hope that we have using this so beautiful, so rich, that moves us, this term that so many philosophers have wrote about? What do you have to tell us about hope in this moment where practical theories are mixed in this beautiful panel? Good afternoon. I'd like to take this opportunity to honor the original peoples of this land, of my land and this land, by greeting Sônia. And my question is for you and Erisvaldo. Algina said that she was a defender of the environment because she cultivated the environment. So we're in a moment where the natural resources of our territories are threatened by a development model. And you, Sônia, especially in the encounter of agroecology, has brought forward a new concept from the peoples, that the development is something that is negative, but that the indigenous peoples think another model. And also the people of Santo, the religious African religions, have also thought on a new model. So what's the impact of this new model in terms of the old development project?
Well, Marcia, when you were talking, I was thinking about a couple of different things. First, the idea of past and future. For a historian, it's hard to think about the present, the immediate present, and it's a challenge that I'm having in this project that I've been engaged in, because history is made of presents. It's made of in the present, but of pasts. And so when we talk about the uses of the present for projects that are looking at the future, we look at political uses of pasts that are ceremonial, historical pasts, and this kind of view actually excludes agents in the past. So the millennial project of neo-Pentecostal churches, especially related to this idea of prosperity, is a project that works from tactical strategies. For example, the political use of Judaic Jewish theology is used to convert those who are kind of sharing their view and killing and eliminating those who disagree with them. So in their vision, there's no room for those who are allies of the present. So my idea is to try and think about how do we stretch that out? How do we think through the projects of the future for these groups? So what does it mean when they are talking about the future? And their project is not focused on the present, it's focused on the future. So how do we think through that? And it's focused on, privileged groups and how they're going to exclude the groups that don't share that worldview. So, and in some sense, we have to give up hopes of a radical transformation in the future. It's as if the perspective of the revolution were no longer important for us because of the gradual changes that happen in the present that can guarantee a better future for everyone. So I keep thinking about where the revolutionary project went. So in some sense, using the Harris concept, the idea of a reactionary revolution, quick changes, radical changes, harkening back to the ideal past and not to an ideal future. So these groups, they have they're trying to bring about a past, the project of the past, not a project of the future. And they're using the present to try and affect radical change. And it's a movement in which practically nobody here would participate. So the ideal past is the past in which there were no contradictions. There was a tremendous equality in the worst sense of the word. So these kinds of groups take us back to this ideal past. And so our challenge, you work with philosophy, we need to think of history against the grain and not just think about ideal pasts, but alternative futures. I think that's about it. I'd like to start with Eduardo's question. Thank you for your question. It's really complicated to keep what I call epistemological vigilance inside the university, because you're constantly being criticized. Your beliefs and what some colleagues do is nothing more than professing beliefs. And I'm not trying to discredit beliefs, but I'm questioning and I'm challenging the way in which they profess those beliefs. So what they're saying really is that the beliefs are not open to discussion, right? So they use these arguments, they profess the beliefs without being willing to listen to the other side. And so it's, the way they studied, and this is the way the world is because this person said this, and some theorists have to be in people think that German philosophers are always right, or American philosophers. It varies, but in any case, they cite these people, and they're not open to debate when they profess these beliefs. And it's not, thought through. It's just professed. And so this really annoys me. But somebody says, "Well, you've never read Wittgenstein," and I say, "So what?" My dissertation was about Kant, but I'd never published an article about it. Why did I study him? Because I wanted to study the racial question. And the two professors who I was working with said, "No, you guys, you can't do this. You can't study this topic." And this was before affirmative action and everything. And so we of the Black movement were getting into the university to bring up these questions. So the question was, you only ever talk about the racial question. You got to talk about something else. And I said, "Well, are you saying that I'm only capable, I only know how to talk about the racial question? Well, let me show you." So I So I went and did my doctorate, and I wrote about Kant just to show that I was capable of, of discussing other concepts. So don't come tell me that I don't know how to talk about anything other than the racial question. Of course, I hated every minute of that dissertation. Don't do that. Don't write a dissertation like this. It was just in reaction to that criticism. It was just to prove somebody else wrong. But yeah, so I did that only to show to my colleagues that I was just as intellectually capable as they were. And I think that it's not easy to do it's not easy to do that with respect to racist attitudes, because nobody admits that they're a racist. They don't admit that they're intolerant. They don't admit that they exclude other people. So I always have to say, we're only going to solve this debate and finish this debate if we actually think through the perspective of alterity, of otherness. There's no salvation for a project of humanity that is unable to consider otherness and the other, without respecting the other the way the other is. So I have a lot of evangelical students in my classes. I have a lot. There's a lot in pedagogy as well, and I talk to them with no problem. I respect them. I support them, and I have not until this day. I've never been the victim of any type of aggression like that. One of my friends went on leave to Oh, excuse me. I went on leave, and there was another professor who was there, and this problem of the racial question came up, and she was debating with me. Excuse me. She was debating with this other professor, and saying, okay, when Erisvaldo comes back, he'll take it up with you. And so when I came back, she never brought it up. I never brought it up, and I preferred to just kind of to have it be water under the bridge. But it's not easy to do that. It's either we maintain this vigilance or we're going to lose the battle. Marcia, I've said that I have an epistemology that we need to deepen, which is the epistemology of the crossroads. And this epistemology is important because I think that it's only from that perspective that we'll be able to value otherness and to recognize among the possibilities, my possibilities and the possibilities that are, that are part of that crossroads. It's only in doing that we'll be able to figure out which way to go. And the place of the really great and grand dialogue is the crossroads. And so we need to think of the crossroads from an epistemological perspective and broaden the possibilities of thinking and acting. Because we don't go to a crossroads only to think. We want to act. We want to choose a direction and move forward. Marta Valgina had a really important role in the last few years. I follow her. I've been reading her work for the last 17 years or so. She's been in my house. We've been in events together, and her loss was there's no way to replace her, and she helped to kind of elevate this debate of religions with African heritage with the ecological religions that are working to defend the environment, and religions that would not exist and will not exist without the ecological, without caring for water and the ecological world, for nature, without caring for the forests, the rocks. So this Valgina, she gave this this contribution to us, and we need to continue with it and make it so that our offering is accepted. With greater greater celebration and fanfare. And I once heard that it was necessary for us to reduce the presents given to Iemanjá, because the present that she really needed was our heart and our strength in religion. Because, you know, we throw a lot of things in the ocean, but we aren't able to experience nature in our lives and really acknowledge the presence of the ocean in our lives. And so one more argument for caring for nature, and our Sônia, she's bringing this really radically to us when she thinks about our existence and nature. In other words, if we put nature in jeopardy, we're putting our own existence in jeopardy. These floods these recent floods where I live and around the area where I live, they keep coming back into my mind, and I can't help but interpret them as a reaction of the planet in the face of the predatory and perverse and exploitative way that capitalism views the world and uses it. And in these both of these events happened a little after the blood moon. I'm not an astrologer, but I think that I think about the universe from my religious perspective. What this might mean, I don't know, but it unsettles me. And I don't know anything about astrology, but I'm a pai de santo. But it unsettled me, and for me, it has to do with the reaction of nature. And another day, I heard Sônia saying that nature is yelling. It's reacting to the predatory approach that capitalism and we are taking with it. All with the goal of, you know, gaining riches.
Just checking if Sônia could hear us and if she wants to reply. I don't think I really understood the first question. I think I remember well the question about the past. About the past, present, and future. The first question was directed to Erisvaldo. But the other two were for everyone. So the question about the past and future and their meanings and the meaning of hope. And the third question was about a new model of development that was not the capitalist model. Well, I think that speaking on the role of the past and the construction of the future and what's hope we have today, I started my talk by saying that we could call it an encounter. What was the invasion of the Europeans? And that this encounter point, even though it was marked by confrontation, means a continuity. So because it's a continuity from this encounter, we couldn't think about a culture being superior to another. We can't adopt a single pattern for everyone, a single model. Everyone should have the right to continue things according to their culture and their peoples. So what happened in Brazil was the continuity of one culture. But even then, we can't disconsider the heritage, the indigenous heritage that remained in society, in the world. As for instance, the breastfeeding. I don't know if you remember, if you've seen the first historical document in Brazil, which was the letter of Pedro Vaz de Caminha, that when he arrived in Brazil, he wrote a letter to the emperor, to the king of Portugal, I'm sorry. And he writes, she found, in the letter, he talks about seeing a woman breastfeeding. About with the boy, I'm sorry. It was really odd for him to see breastfeeding from another boy. Yes. So in Europe, this was already not done for older babies, or it never existed. So we already know that this is a sort of an indigenous tradition. So many words in our vocabulary in Brazil, so many foods that are all from the indigenous origins. So in respect to this encounters, misencounters, and continuity, with the indigenous that were already here, we were part of the land. And this land that was coveted. And because of this greed of the natural resources, we had to get out of the way. And so today we are seen as obstacles. So to who does it benefit to reduce the indigenous people, to exterminate the indigenous people that existed and continue to exist today? Because if you're going to talk superficially about Brazil's history, it could be seen as a report on domination, which continues to be constant domination. But that report is too superficial, it's too simplistic, and it interests only those who wants to categorize the indigenous people as primitive, as backward, or as someone who always needs somebody else, a savior, the white people, to impose themselves. So we live till today resisting as a origin people, as traditional people, as first people, to maintain our autonomy in the world. So you can't reduce this history as if it was only one history and deny our past. Because today that's what the books are doing. They deny our history. Only tell that first encounter as if we're people of the past. Always using the past tense of verbs to talk about indigenous people, and never the present tense. Never talk about the Indian who is present, and it's this present Indian who's concerned about the future, that is struggling, that is fighting to guarantee a future for all. Because it's our way of life, it's our resistance that is keeping us from repeating the past, our colonial past, our dictator past. And we are in this moment trying to build this future, a future that respects diversity, a future that understands that we are not separate people from the nature. We are the nature. We are the environment. And we are interconnected and depend on each other. The environment depends on us to keep, to be preserved, to be standing, to continue alive. But we also need it in order to remain alive, to survive. So today, land is the main object of dispute, not only in Brazil, but in all of Latin America. It's the main object of dispute for exploration of the ground, of the underground, of the waters. So we have all the struggles, this confrontation with people from the most powerful sectors. And because we are confronting these government sectors, these elite sectors, the power sectors, we are always under threat. We are always a target. And once again, we appear as an obstacle to development, which for us is a word that does not fit anywhere. Because development for us is the antonym of embracing, of belonging, of envelopment. That would be the word she's using, but it's more belonging. So development is the, yeah. So what we want is a policy of involvement, of bringing people together, of guaranteeing the collective use of the territory that is sustainable, that guarantees people's rights. What should matter are the relationships, because the GDP, the market stocks, that's what matters. The market matters, and not the well-being and the social lives of people, which in the names of the increase of the GDP and the valorization of the stock are being sacrificed. As Erisvaldo said, what happened in Brumadinho and Mariana, the dams that broke? That was a crime. The families are suffering in the name of this greed for capitalism. So another model we want that guarantees today and tomorrow is the model that respects the way of life. And for that, you need to demarcate the indigenous lands. We need a land reform. And most of all, we need to preserve our waters and environments as an alternative. So the concentration of lands and the concentration of income needs to be faced and by us. So for that, we need to have that consciousness that we are responsible for that change. I'm apologizing, but we can't have a round of questions because we are in the nick of time. And dinner is going to be later. So instead of more questions now, our chief organizing is telling us that we're going to finish here, leaving a lot for us to reflect on and think about. Sometimes we talk about democracy without only thinking about elections and parties, and that are very important, but institutions. But we need to, today's panels, this one specifically, has left us with a reflection which is very complex, that includes land, culture, religion, and politics. So how all of that interlink and overlap, and how they and how they define democracy or not democracy. So with this final thought of this panel, I'd like us to round of applause.